Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Ta-Nehisi Street. I'm here, as always, with my brothers Seti and Kareem, and today we have an extraordinary special guest, Ta-Nehisi Coates. Before I introduce Ta-Nehisi, who doesn't need an introduction, really, let me remind all our viewers and listeners to kindly subscribe if you're interested in our Patreon feed. The link is below, and also to give a 5-star review when you can. Ta-Nehisi Coates is an award-winning author and journalist. His books include The Water Dancer, and his most recent book is, of course, The Message, which was published by One World, an imprint of Random House. Ta-Nehisi is currently a contributing editor of Vanity Fair and the Sterling Brown Endowed Chair in the English Department at Howard University. Ta-Nehisi also enjoyed a successful run writing Marvel's Black Panther between 2016 and 2021, and Captain America between 2018 and 2021 comic series. So Ta-Nehisi, welcome to our show. So Ta-Nehisi, thank you again for joining the Ta-Nehisi Street podcast. I guess the first question we have for you, based on this extraordinary book that you wrote, The Message, is the question of how and why did you discover Palestine? And I guess where was Palestine for you before you wrote The Message?
Oh man, that's a great question. I just remember being a kid and my dad watching like World News Tonight or whatever, and I tried to do the time on this to figure out what it would have been going on, and I think it would have been a war in Lebanon about then. This would have been like the early to mid 1980s or so, or a portion of the war in Lebanon. And I just remember that my dad very strongly identified with the Palestinians, and my mom did too. These I had parents who were really smart, read a lot, but like most people that we grew up around, they weren't particularly well traveled. It's not like they'd been to Palestine, but something about it made them identify in that particular way, and I remember that. And then I went off to school, and there was always I think at Howard this kind of background hum of sympathy for the Palestinian cause. And maybe that's just being around left movements and everything. Um, and then I think I had these ambitions. I've tried to think a lot about my career and like I think like I probably do not come off as the most um, radical of people. And I think part of that is like my chosen profession. That is to say, in this world of literary magazines, New Yorker, Atlantic, New Republic, like those sorts of places. What I've come to realize there actually is a politic there, that it's not just a form, that there is a politic there also, that is pretty clear. Increasingly, some of that's being broken down, but certainly in the period I was coming up, there was a politic. I was bathed in that politic, and so I think as I talk about in the message, I guess in the back of my head, I thought, I will keep my politics, but I will learn this form that I admire so much and that I love and that I adore. And the fact of the matter is, it was hard to separate, one from the other. It is difficult to remain yourself when you're not, surrounded by people who necessarily, I don't want to say share your values, but I guess for lack of a better term, share your politics, because there were good people everywhere I worked. There were always, really, really good people who looked out for me. But I give that long way of intro to say is I don't know if anywhere that politic more marked than it was, as I look back now, than in terms of Palestine and Palestinians. At the end of the message, towards the end, I talk about Maha Nasser's research and the extent to which those very publications, for the most part, shunted Palestinian voices, Palestinian life, and Palestinians themselves, to the side. They were to be talked about. And so the case for reparations, which is how I got here and how I got to the message, it reflects that politic. It just does. And it was quickly brought to my attention that this was not great. Largely probably because of everything I've said before, I intuitively perceived that it, once it was brought to my attention, that it might not be great. Why it was not great was a process that really culminated in the publication of this book. That's a very long answer, and I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay. That's a great answer. So I guess to go straight into the book itself, the message deals with these three experiences that you write about incredibly beautifully and with extraordinary empathy. first your visit to Senegal, then you have the experience in South Carolina with sort of, I don't want to call it book burning, but basically like a banning of books and so on,
Book burning is better.
and book burning. And then the last section and the longest section really is about Palestine. And you write a lot about translating experiences across very different contexts. And on page 229, for example, of the book, you write juxtaposing sort of the extraordinary Black American writer and historian W.E.B. Du Bois, and how he was basically censored and in a sense denied a platform for the longest time. And then, of course, you juxtapose that with the Palestinians, as you said. You referred to Mahan Nasser just now. But Du Bois was writing in 1935, and as you point out, Palestinians are being denied access today. So how, Ta-Nehisi, how does the incredibly, honestly, racist backlash that you've been exposed to over the past few weeks that we've been following and all the interviews you've been giving, how does that change your sense of where America is today and your understanding of America?
I'm kind of the wrong person to ask because I've been working really hard not to see it. This is proven only moderately effective because people send me things or I'm on shows and people say, "Hey, did you see this?" You know what I mean? And then I see it. But look, I when I was publishing the message, I knew what I was doing. I knew exactly what I was doing. I knew who I was and I knew what I was doing. When I was doing interviews for New York Magazine for the piece that came out, I didn't know I would be on the cover, but I knew the piece would be a big deal. You're surprised when you see things, but when you sit back and think about it, it's not surprising at all. I mean, but I guess I just feel like,
Why is it not surprising, Ta-Nehisi? Can I ask you why is it not
yeah,
surprising to you?
sure. I mean, because if what I wrote was true, then this is what should happen. Like if what I wrote was true, this is what's supposed to happen. You know what I mean? Um, and what I've maintained, I think, even before this book, was that racism, white supremacy, are not forces that are the side dishes, in the American plate. They're the main course. They run right down the spine. You can't understand this country without the genocide of its indigenous people and without the importation and enslavement, of its descendants from Africa. And, one of the most enlightening messages that I, received when I was writing a book, or ideas that I received when I was writing a book, is that continues internationally. That in fact continues globally. That is not history. It's active and alive. I mean, as we lead up to the election, I mean, one of the things, and I don't have an answer for this, but one of the things I've been like trying to think about is, for so long, this country maintained its democracy, and crucial to its democracy and the establishment of its democracy was keeping Black people out of it. Now that's less and less true. But to what extent are we maintaining a democracy, for lack of a better way of saying this, by inflicting great misery on other people internationally? And what is the scope of that? What is the relationship, of that? Is that even true? I don't know, but just take the past, I don't know, 25 years, and I'm being generous and conservative here, but the 25 years of policy and wars and violence, that we brought to the Mideast, it's not good, man. It's not good at all. It's not great.
Ta-Nehisi, one of the most powerful passages in the book occurs on about in that same discussion Osama was just asking about, where you invoked Du Bois, and you make the point really powerfully that but the difference between writing and sort of violent struggle. You say the passage has to do with the power of the sword as opposed to the power of the pen, to use that kind of cliche, but you don't use the cliche. You say, and I'm quoting you, "Forced to match sword for sword, gun for gun, slaveholders and white supremacists would be confident in victory, if only because their vast wealth assured them an unmatched arsenal." And you make the point then that writing opens up a way
Yeah.
for the lesser among us, so to speak, the weaker people, so to speak, to speak back, to fight back in a way. But you also make a super important point in that same place. You say that power, that is the power of writing, needs a host as sure as an arrow needs a longbow to launch it. And then, of course, that opens up the whole question of how does one get, I mean, writing is one thing, having an audience is another thing, right? Which is partly what you're talking about there. And your whole experience the past, month and a half or 2 months since this book came out has been about the question of visibility and platform, who gets to speak, who gets to represent, and so forth. Edward Said wrote an essay that I think you quote in the book, if I remember right, called "Permission to Narrate" back in the 1980s. He was our uncle, by the way, in case you didn't know that. But
I did not know that.
yeah,
Wow.
so here we are, 40 whatever
I'm sorry,
years
and your
now.
uncle how? Like mother, father, can you trace the lineage for me, please?
Our mother's brother, our mother's older brother.
So here we are 40 years or so after he wrote that essay about permission to narrate. Palestinians are still trying to get access to at least mainstream media platforms. We have access to other platforms to read, including this one, for example, that we've created. But it's hard for Palestinians. So what do you make of this whole question of access and who controls access to the media? And one of the things you've said in all of your media appearances recently has been, Ta-Nehisi, I don't speak for Palestinians. That's not my job. That's not my role. They should speak for themselves. But it's though you're trying to open up a space for Palestinians to be able to speak for themselves in sort of mainstream media platforms. So I was just wondering, partly because of what you write, partly because of your recent experience talking about it, where are you now with this question of access, gatekeeping, the right to narrate? Really, that's fundamentally what we're talking about here. What do you think of all these things? Sorry, that's a bundle of questions, but
No, that's great. That's great. And because you guys are Edward Said's nephews, I'm going to correct you and say the correct pronunciation is Ta-Nehisi. And people who I don't care about, I don't correct.
I appreciate that.
I just let them keep going. um, um, yeah, and I can't remember whether that actually is the permission to narrate or Orientalism. I can't remember. I know what quote you're talking about, but it's actually the quote about how writers serve as apologists often for empire, and how every empire swears it is it's different, and then you get these intellectuals who go on about why this is different, which is exactly the case of what happens in terms of Israel, Zionism, and apartheid. Where is that? Where am I in that? I'll say a couple things. Like the fight for access is very, very familiar to me. We are at a point in history where, some of the magazines I just mentioned and some of the newspapers, the New York Times, New Yorker, Atlantic, etc., certainly New Republic, there are Black writers in those pages, and very prominent Black writers in those pages, by the way. In fact, in some of those pages, some of the the most well-known ones are there. That was not the case 20 years ago. This is a very, very recent development. And I really don't think it would have happened if Barack Obama hadn't got elected. Because I think a lot of these places looked around and was like, this is absurd. We can't, not have people that can explain this. I don't really know what to do in terms of the problem with Palestinian and Palestinian American writers. This is a huge deal. So I just want to talk about power for a moment. That passage you read is very, very important, because I think the first thing it does is it points to the innate power of oppressed people. And I shouldn't say innate. The power comes from the condition. That's what I want to say. The power is not in your bones. Power comes from the condition. There's an Elaine Locke quote earlier in there where he says that basically all human populations under immense pressure, things become much, much more profound for you. If you think about your personal life, you probably can talk about, moments like that where you've been under stress or under pressure, and things just clarify for you, in a particular way. And so now you take a group of people under, you put them under those conditions, and then you get a kind of culture, which Elaine Locke says, amounts to, the makings of classical art. And so you can't buy your way to great writing, man. You can't, you can have be the most richest person in the world, a billionaire 10 times over. That will not make you a great writer. Those are not the same things, and I just want to sit with that for a moment, because what it says is that there is great, I don't even want to call it potential, but there's great stuff there. You know what I mean? I think there's a reason why the tradition of African American writing is so central to American writing. And I think it has to do with the conditions. And so that's the optimistic part of it. Creating the institutions, besieging the institutions that have already been created to do the right thing. is a significantly harder job. I'm doing my best, for lack of a better term, to shame as many of them as I can, because it is shameful. I think the basic problem is this: the argument for an Israeli state, as it exists right now, runs something like the Palestinians deserve apartheid because of what they did. It runs something like that, because the facts of apartheid are not like really contestable. You know, I don't know if y'all saw this weekend, but the New York Times ran this thing with the different roads along the way, which I've never seen the New York Times do. The facts of it are immediately apparent. And, you know, we talk about the roads so much that we almost trivialize them. Because, you know, from what I saw, this redounds all through life. You can't contest the fact that in the occupied territories, there are two legal systems. This is just incontestable. This is not an argument. You know what I mean? That there are one set of rights here and another set, you know, over there. You simply can't contest like the fact that Israel has nation state laws that make very clear what its identity is, and that favors one group of people over the other. You just can't. Like there is no, you know, equality between Jewish Israelis and anybody else. That these are facts. And so what you're left with is like an honest framing of that argument is, I believe I should be able to impose apartheid until I feel safe. That's the honest argument, you know? And if you listen to some of the, you know, interviews I've done, that is effectively what the argument is, even though they won't say it like that. But they basically say, why is that? You know, as if there is a why to justify apartheid. And in their mind, I guess there actually is, you know? And I'll say two things about that. That has been clarifying for me on two levels. The first level is I now understand who would be segregationists in this country and who would not. Because they clearly endorse segregation somewhere else and have no problem with it. Because those were the exact same arguments made about segregation here, you know, that it would make white people unsafe. But I also think most Americans, as naive as this sounds, they actually can't stomach that argument. Like if you laid it out starkly, they would say, I can't, look, two roads? Like what? You know what I mean? Like what? Like that offends, even in our blinkered sense. There is something in the ethic about fairness and, you know, a kind of anti-discrimination ethic. And I think if that weren't true, people wouldn't have to spend so much time lying. So the question becomes, are the institutions themselves, and this is one I have not figured out, are they actually separate from the interests that maintain that segregation? And that is a question I'm trying to work my way through. The last thing I'll say about this, and I'm sorry I'm going on so long, but the last thing I'll say about this is we pay for our ignorance. We pay for our ignorance because we don't have an accurate picture of what is actually happening in Palestine. When a presidential candidate stands up and says, I am for a two-state solution, we don't say, like, we don't have a familiarity with the map. We don't know where the settlements are. So we don't say, wow, that sounds crazy given what's going on right now. We don't say that because we don't have an accurate picture of what is actually happening and what it looks like. But it's been said so much that it becomes like this cliche in the back of our heads, you know? And so like we are paying right now for our ignorance because somebody got burnt to death that was plugged up to an IV yesterday. And those were our munitions. And some kids saw that. And I don't like talking like this, but I firmly believe we're going to pay for that. Like, I just don't think you get to just outsource violence like that and not ever have it come back to you.
So Ta-Nehisi, on that exact point, I mean, it's exactly, we agree with everything you just said, of course. And it's this question when you say that part of the gatekeeping is precisely to prevent what is so obvious once you go to Palestine. You saw Palestine, you went there, you describe your experience in Hebron and other places as well. And, you know, and you see the segregation there, and it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking because it's in the 21st century. And then you think, how do people justify it? But isn't that exactly what, as you said earlier just now, isn't that precisely what the experience of not just Black Americans, but all oppressed groups in this country have gone through in a previous period? Because people saw segregation in the South Jim Crow, what's called Jim Crow. So for our viewers and listeners who don't know what Jim Crow is, the legal segregation in the U.S. South, up until the mid 20th century. Isn't that people saw these things and justified it? Isn't that the sheer terror of what, in other words, what you're describing is that people can see evil and still, or depravity, and still justify it. They did it in the 19th century, they did it in the 20th century, and they're doing it now. So how far have we? Do you see that? That's what I struggle
Yes, I'm
with.
going to give you an optimistic take. I don't think people can see depravity and justify it. I actually think they have to find some way to not see it. I actually, and I'm thinking about this in the case. For instance, I think about like the Civil War, and there's a great book by this Civil War historian named Chandra Manning, and the book is called "What This Cruel War Was Over." And she talks about how, these white soldiers who came south, racist, no love for black people, whatever, wanting to fight for union. But when they can't see slavery up close and justify it, though. Like, once they actually see it, it's very hard for them. And they might still hold, racist, but once they see, oh, you're selling people, like, it becomes really, really hard. And I actually think that is the reason why so much is invested. Like, I have to believe that's tied to the lack of access, in terms, and I hate it, I'm using these words, but the inability of big media organizations to get behind Palestinian writers, storytellers, journalists, etc. Because I think I really do believe we'd have a different politic. It's hard, man. I mean, like your argument is we want to wipe out 2% of Gaza's population to protect, and I'm saying this in the mildest terms possible. We have the right to wipe out 2% of Gaza's population in order to maintain a regime of two-tiered citizenship, discrimination, in which one ethnic group is superior to all others. I didn't understand it that clearly, for instance. I myself, I did not understand it that clearly. And I don't think most people do. And I think if they could really look away, if they really could justify it, then why does the ADL spend so much money making sure no one hears it? I actually think once you lay it plain, like, it's a tough case to make, man. It's a tough case to make, so the case can't be made.
Ta-Nehisi, I totally agree with you. Like, I think the fact your own narrative of going, for example, to Hebron, like 5 minutes in Hebron, take that guy on CBS who was hassling you, just put him 5 minutes. All it takes is 5 minutes in downtown central, the old city of Hebron. 5 minutes, everything is very, very clear. Not just two different roads, two different, everything, like visually, who can go, who can't go, who's there, who's not there, who's locked up, who has freedom. 5 minutes, right? So this is why I think actually these questions are connected. The gatekeeping, that's why even somebody like you, who's up, always your entire writing career, totally involved in these kinds of questions. Why did you not know when you wrote the essay on reparations?
Why did I not know?
Why did you not know? It's like it's not your fault, right? It's like there's a whole system that's there in order for people not to know. Because I agree with you, by the way, fundamentally. I think most Americans these days would not support the system if they knew that that's what it was. I just think that there are systems of denial, systems of censorship, systems of mental and intellectual repression and they're designed to keep people from seeing what's actually happening, which is why you don't know about Hebron until you have to physically go to Hebron. It's kind of which is insane, right? Like, why do you have to actually go all the way there to see something that could be you convey it very powerfully in your writing. Other people have too, right? But we don't. It's again, we come back to this question of access. Why do we not know these things? It's 2024. It's kind of stunning, I think.
Yeah, and I think I think most people think Israel's a democracy. Like, I think they really think that. But I just believe if I said, listen, there are whole swaths of people that can't vote. You know what I mean? There are whole swaths of people that, put voting aside, have no choice, in terms of, who their ultimate rulers are going to be. And those that do are also unequal. They do not have the same set of rights, as Israeli Jews, even though they're called citizens. And I think if you put those facts before people and you said, is that a democracy? Like, if that were in America, would you say that was a democracy? And they would say no. But you hear like these really powerful figures say over and over again, they repeat these, this kind of branding. Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel has the right to defend itself. The Jewish state has a right to exist. And this kind of gets locked into your head. You know what I mean? And people say it so much that like you don't even take a moment to understand, the content of it. I mean, like for me, obviously this came up in the CBS thing too, but like the right to, like, that is an absurd statement. The right to exist. States are not alive. I don't care like a state is not a living thing. A state is not a child. A state is a creation of people, of human beings. And we should be concerned about the rights of human beings. And to the extent that a state promotes the rights of human beings, the happiness, I mean this, I want this for, Jewish Israelis. I want this for everybody. To the extent that it promotes the human rights, happiness, and well-being of people, then that's a good state. It's serving its purpose. To the extent that it's not, we should have deep, deep questions.
I mean, yeah, I absolutely fundamentally agree. So I was just there's another set of questions I want to ask you about, slightly going back to history, and then we're going to come back to the present a little bit too, which is that when you look back at the African American, well, I don't want to say there are so many, but like African American approaches to Palestine. Osama mentioned already, you've talked about Du Bois already back in the 30s. Du Bois was, whether for whatever reason, probably because he wasn't sufficiently informed for all the reasons we've been talking about.
Definitely because he was not informed on Palestine.
But he was sympathetic to Zionism, right?
He evolved, right? Have you seen the stuff about him in NASA? Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, he did. It's true. MLK sort of similarly, although he also by the end also started to, like, lights were going on in his head clearly. He could start to see. So there's that. And then, but of course, then there are people back in the 60s and 70s, Muhammad Ali, the boxer, Malcolm X, and so forth, who were starting to see things. James Baldwin, for example, began one way, then the light went on and he changed. But then there's a more recent tradition of Black writers. Actually, no, I'm skipping like June Jordan and people like that in the 1980s too. But there's
can I ask a question? Wait.
Yeah.
I didn't think about this when I was writing the message. How many Black writers start off as sympathetic to Zionism and then say, "Wait a minute"?
Those, I think it's a good question, and there are a lot of books on that. But I think, Karim, I mean, there are a lot of people who just didn't know, honestly, and were like Du Bois. I mean, it's the greatest example, the most extraordinary writer who's so powerful in his writing about the white world, what he calls the white world, and he sees
by the way,
all this ideology.
C.L.R. James too.
And C.L.R. James didn't talk about.
It should have been obvious to him. But I remember when Edward met C.L.R. James in London. By then James was old, so who knows? But Edward was shocked at like his lack of sympathy to the Palestinian cause. So it can happen.
Yeah, but basically, like, I think it's a question of many of them just were not aware, and then I think people like MLK, I think towards the end, especially when he starts talking about poverty in the Vietnam War. And I think of course, he was killed and assassinated. So I think who knows what would have happened if MLK had lived a few more years to see what was going on. But then you have, as Sadie said, June Jordan, and you have Alice Walker, and you have a whole range of writers who are extraordinary and who've been very sort of from the beginning who've seen. And so again, I think it's a question of access and a question of being allowed to frame, because once you see it, you relate. It's so obvious. But then that raises another question, Ta-Nehisi, which is the question of, does it? I mean, since you do what you describe in your book, you keep referring to translation, and you're talking about the translation of different experiences in different spaces, and then you're putting them together. Translation to actually reconcile, in a sense, these two different realities of oppression: Jim Crow, and then Palestine today. But does it require somebody to have that experience of oppression to be able to see that what is going on in Palestine is in fact wrong and depraved? Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, does one?
No, I don't think it does.
Okay, so how do you answer, or how do you deal with somebody who says, but Ta-Nehisi, we don't have that experience, therefore we're not able to relate to. We can't think of Jim Crow and Palestine. We're coming from a different space, so to speak. What would you tell those people? So people who don't have
in American, is that person
in America? Yeah. Let's say in America.
I just think they would. I think one of the true successes, and I want to come back to this question of evolution too, which is interesting to me because I think it highlights something that is actually complicated about the story, though not like hard to grasp. I think one of the successes of the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle is it has injected a basic ethic in the American populace. And I'm not saying this ethic is always followed, but it exists. That it is wrong for the state to treat different people different ways. That to put it crudely. So you can't have, you know what I mean? Like this idea, like at one point in American history, Black people could not serve as judge, jury, etc. Couldn't even serve as witnesses, for something. That was wrong. It's widely thought that is wrong. You know what I mean? That at the very least, we should have a patina of fairness, that we should go before, the same system. Now, obviously, there is massive inequality within that system. So please don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But there's a basic ethic that de jure segregation, de jure discrimination is not a good thing. And everybody has to at least pay lip service to that, even if they would do something else in other conditions. And that just takes me back to my point, which is that I think if this was laid barely before people, it would be indefensible, man. I think it would be indefensible. And I'm not even saying anything about like the security arguments in terms of how it puts us in danger, et cetera. I'm speaking very crude right now, about how it puts, Americans in danger, et cetera. The amount of money expended, all that. I don't think it's defensible. And again, I say this because I don't know why so much money and so much effort and so much power would be expended when telling a particular story. I mean, one of the things I go through in the messages, all of the movies, the novels, like the culture of lying about this. It's a lot of cultural work that goes into this, man. And I think it's because they know. It's, the beautiful thing about the truth is it's easy, but lies are hard. Lies are really hard to maintain, because you start pushing on it and then the person has to tell another lie. Then they got to tell another, and the truth is just, this is what happened, man. This is what happened, end of story.
That's why Zionism, they have to come up with all these slogans: a land without a people, for a people without a land, blah, blah, blah.
That's also why the lobby has to work 24/7.
Yeah, for sure.
They can't sleep. It's like they're constantly turning. They can't sleep. They just have to keep going.
They can't sleep. And within that, by the way, is a weakness. Within that is a weakness. It doesn't mean that they aren't without power and not strong, but there is a weakness in the fact that they have to lie, that they can't rest.
Sorry, I don't know if you can hear, because I'm coming in and out. I'm not being able to follow everything, but I wanted to ask you, I have this powerful case in your book when you talked about the U.S. ambassador in Jerusalem. He puts up this plaque, and it's something to the effect of, about the Israel and the Jewish people, etc., kind of connecting with the ideals of America. And after you had sort of spoken about Jim Crow and all this kind of history of slavery and Jim Crow, etc., there's this strange thing where, yes, there is a kind of connection with it, but not the connection that this guy, I think it's David Friedman, if I'm not mistaken, it's David Friedman, the ambassador, right? It's very much the connection, but it's not the connection that he's referring to. On the other hand, that's kind of one of these things where clearly this notion of trying to connect and say, we are them and they are us, to the extent where now, if I can just sort of get into the politics of what's going on now, where the US is sending in its own sort of army, its own troops, its own people to go in and defend the Israelis, a foreign state, after all, from something where it's conducting a genocide, where they're invading my country, Lebanon, at the moment, where there's all this violence taking place, and all of which could be settled by the US through a ceasefire. All this could stop overnight. So this connecting and trying to insist. So yes, there's the lobby in America, but then outside of America, there's this sense of we're connecting in the way. And I know you wrote a lot about Herzl and trying to say, Zionism is this outpost of civilization from Western civilization into into Palestine, into that region. And of course, that's what the colonial powers, often say. So I found that really, really powerful, where you're able to kind of make these connections. But I was pushing back as well on what you were saying, Sari, that I think this obviously resonates somewhere. Doesn't it resonate? It seems to resonate among those in power. And so I want to also ask you, so if you can talk about that, but also I'm curious, because this is a question I keep having after Jim Crow, after you have the civil rights, after you have the emancipation, you also have this stream of kind of Black Americans that go into power and then become power. So they're no longer, they appear not to be anymore representing that kind of Black American sort of coming in without the rights and and cognizant of this narrative that you talk again so powerfully about, the narrative, the stories, but instead they become the powerful. I'm thinking, even right now you have, Kamala Harris is around, Barack Obama was there, the UN ambassador Linda Greenfield, Lloyd Austin. There's a whole number of people that are in power, and I'm sitting there listening, saying, "But you guys are talking about Palestine, you're talking about Lebanon, you're talking as though these are not humans." And so, how does that kind of connect or disconnect? In as far as when you've been researching and writing this.
Well, I'll do the dark part of it first. The dark part of it is I think it reifies one of the lessons, or one of the hard things to accept about Israel and about Zionism, and that is that people can undergo horrific, inhuman oppression, and this does not mean that they will emerge as people who would not inflict oppression themselves. And I actually think, just to go back, and I promise, Kareem, I'll come back to your question, but I think just to go back, I suspect that explains a lot about a Black writer like Du Bois, like Baldwin, and maybe even C.L.R. James, like their initial sympathy to Israel. What they are thinking about is they're thinking about a state for a group of people who the West tried to wipe off the face of the planet. Like that's in their mind, that's how they're processing it, right? I think also in the background of that is the tremendous force of nationalism as an idea, which you just see around the world, and certainly in the Black community has, had a particular hold. And so, wow, those who survived Hitler's, genocidal campaigns have achieved the dream of nationalism. And we have a hard time. It's like the world is set up for you in a certain way, and you say, okay, so I need to succeed according to this, but you don't really interrogate what is actually set up in the first place. You know what I mean? So you don't say nationalism based on what, nation, on whose land, who was there before, like all of the, the second, third, tier questions. You just say, okay, this is the measure of success. This is where I need to get, and I think that explains a lot, about where we are now. You know what I mean? Where you have a generation of Black leaders who see themselves, you know what I mean, in the way that, the Jewish people have historically been treated by the West and by Europe, pre-Israel, and find, some level of identification in that, and even in some cases admiration, because the feeling is that they are a successful minority, and so there's a natural sort of alliance there, but not taking a moment and asking yourself, but what is success? Is the system itself unjust, or is our quest just to be masters of the system? Which is it? Which is it? And I think at our best, we conclude that the system itself is unjust. I do want to complicate this a little bit. If you look at any opinion poll, and you look at who has the most questions about Gaza, it tends to be Black voters, ethnically, by and large. That's my moment of optimism, and that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you look at the early initiatives when ceasefire was considered a bad word, in those first couple months, the only sponsors were people of color. You know what I mean? A large number of them were Black. In terms of the congressional sponsors. If you look at who AIPAC took out in the last election cycle, it was Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. It was two Black, Congress people. And so, there is a war within us. You know what I mean? There is a war of conscience within us. There are those amongst us who understand, you know what I mean, that we're supposed to, take out the system. We're supposed to change the system. We're not just supposed to become masters of it. I walk down the street in New York and people who have seen, me or seen whatever, just a large number, of Black folks. The night Kamala gave her speech, I was in Chicago. I couldn't watch it.
You're talking about the DNC speech?
DNC speech. Yes, the DNC speech. Thank you for clarifying that. I couldn't watch it, but I got coaxed in going to a party that night. And I was not in a partying mood, as you can imagine. And I get in there, and 3 straight Black folks come up to me, 2 Black women and a Black man. And they say, man, this is bad. This is really, really bad. And so some level, it's understood. It is wrong for us to go along with this. Now, the extent to which we can seize power and make some changes there, and that part of us that knows this is wrong, can win out, that remains to be seen.
But on that, Karim, can I follow up on that point, Ta-Nehisi? Just on that very point, when you say, I mean, so before you wrote this book, The Message, so after the reparations essay, the famous essay, and this book, presumably you interacted with some of, I mean, not necessarily with Linda Greenfield or with Kamala Harris, or whatever. It's not about specific individuals, but is it that they know what's going on, and they just can't, and just for political reasons they just don't, they understand where power is, and therefore they're not going to cross a certain line? Or is it
Obama, the famous thing
Obama,
with Obama, with Edward and Rashid Khalidi and all these people? He knew
these are people who
those.
they know they're not. Yeah, these are, like, especially Obama. These are extraordinarily smart individuals, and so the idea is it that they know and they just realize, okay, this is the price of power. This is the gate. This is it. I have to do this. If I was going to say this, I'm never going to get where I want to go. Or do you think, is it that they, I don't know, it seems weird, because I mean, the thing about what you were talking about earlier, Du Bois and those people were brilliant people who, once they realized, they said, no way. James Baldwin.
Yeah, but they were writers. They were writers.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
weren't politicians.
Yeah, fair enough. So what's the relationship between the writers and the politicians? Is it just about, so it has nothing to do, in other words, I guess the difference between a writer and a politician on this question, and how you've navigated this over the past, let's say, 15 years.
So it's clear to it became, I was shocked when I got back, because I started talking to people. Yes, a number of people do know. It's wild. A number of people do know. And what is crazy is there are people who I've talked to who went over there on an AIPAC tour and still were like, wait, what? You know what I mean? That's why I'm saying the lie is hard to maintain. Like, here's the tour by the sponsor so that, to make it so you don't see apartheid. And yet, you know what I mean? Still, people are looking like, wait, something's wrong here. Something's wrong here, So yes, there is a population of people that know. And I don't even know that it's the price of power, man. Again, I knew what I was doing when I did this. But to speak on this, and to speak of Palestinians as a people deserving of human rights, whose human rights are being violated right now, it's not just to lose power. It's to make your life a living hell. I just want you to understand, like, I published this book, and behind this book is an entire team. There are editors, there are PR people, there's marketing people, you know what I mean? Publicists, assistant editors, and all of them are tied to this. Like, all of them believe in this book. Like, these are not like random faces. Like, all of them are like, this is what I got into the field to do, right? And I will tell you, a lot of those people are having a hard time right now. Much harder time than I am.
Meaning what? What do you mean by that? I mean, you're the one who's being vilified. You're the one who's being vilified. You're the one who's being attacked.
I signed up for it. I mean, I'm good. I signed up for that. It's like I got into a fight. I knew I was getting into a fight. I wrote it. Listen, man. I am so filled with anger over what I saw that I really don't care. Like, on some level, I don't know how I can be myself. I don't know how I look at my son. I don't know how I look at my wife and not have this fight. Like, sometimes you just see something like that, and it really doesn't matter what happens. I don't know how else to explain it, but I'm the writer, right? Like, I knew that. I'm the writer. But for other people, you know what I mean? Whose emails are hacked, or who get nasty texts, from people who they thought, were friends, people whose spouses, get nasty, attacks. I mean, it is, it's really tough. Now, you still should do it. I want to be clear about this. You still should do it. But I'm saying, these are not power hungry people. You know what I mean? Like, these are not people who are trying to, you know what I mean? I don't know, whatever. Like, on the contrary, these are people who believe in justice. But what happens is, anytime you do this, and it would have been the same thing during the civil rights movement, you will, your reward will not come from the status quo. you might not get any reward at all, really. I, the writer, I get a reward. And my reward is I have cleared my conscience, and I have to say, I have acquired community in places I never thought I would. And that has been a tremendous gift. That alone has made it worth it.
Dan, just a quick question. I mean, I think we want to get on to other issues, but on the question of the publishers, you're not allowed to say this, you're not allowed to do that, and there's several owners and several people that kind of run this, and no matter how sympathetic the editors or some of the writers want to be, they're stopped. And this includes the TV presenters and others who, they want to say something, then there's somebody comes and says, no, you have to say this is a terrorist. You have to say, if it's an Israeli, you have to mention their name. Today, there's on Sky News in the UK, there was the attack at the Israeli army barracks yesterday, and they read out the names and the family members, etc., of each of the Israeli soldiers that were killed. And you're sitting there thinking, that same night, there was these people that were, including this girl, and these people stuck to the hospital that were burned alive, and they were filming these people stuck and burnt alive inside the building. And you say, what are their names? Where are they? So this idea of putting in names, of humanizing, I think it seems to be that there's a lot more sympathy and empathy with people, but not at that. So we're talking about the political level, but also at the people that own these papers and own these TV stations, etc. Do you see any breakthrough there at all, or? I mean, is the anger against you because you succeeded in this, because you came above it and you're sort of going through it?
Yeah, probably. I think it's probably abnormal, maybe, to have the success I had and then to do this. I think maybe that more happens when you're younger and you're full of fury. Then after, you've had awards and success in publishing. So maybe it's unexpected, and there's some amount of anger in that. It is very difficult. It is extremely, extremely difficult. I just, at some point, my book tour will be over. And at some point, I won't, like all of my publicity, all of that, will be done. It's really important to me that something structurally changed. By which I mean, it's really, really important to me that we start having Palestinian voices involved in narrating what's actually happening. And I think the great power in that argument is that it is indefensible not to. There is no way in this world we could imagine a mainstream newspaper saying it's going to cover racism and not having any Black reporters. That would be absurd. That would be absurd. But that is effectively the argument we're making. So I don't know.
Ta-Nehisi, I think I agree with you. I think we all agree with you, but in the sense that I think things really are changing. I think that we are. I think the war in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, especially with younger people, has opened up their eyes to, which is now people are going to be saying, but why didn't I realize? Now I think all the people who might have said, why didn't I know? Now they know, or more and more of them know anyway. I think we're at and maybe my brothers say I'm too optimistic. I don't know, but I think we're at this turning point in all kinds of ways, where it's like there's a drip, drip, drip. I don't know, use the metaphor, whichever metaphor you want, drip, 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 or the straw that breaks the camel's back, or whatever, right? That's this moment when suddenly something changes and it becomes possible to see things and to think with more clarity and to kind of break past the layers of denial and mystification. And I think your book represents that. I think your book captures that moment. Although it's not just you, obviously, right? But I think we're at a place where we can start to imagine having more exposure to Palestinian narratives and Palestinian points of view and so forth. Although we're also at a point where there are forms of racism that Arab Americans experience, for example, that other communities, publicly, legally, still don't. Like one of our recent guests was Maya Berry of the Arab American Institute, who was told in a congressional hearing a couple of
Yeah,
weeks ago. You may have seen
yeah.
that.
I know Maya. Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So okay. So like so you know what happened? Like it's unbelievable. Like that. Like for that to happen to almost anybody else in the Senate. Not that there's obviously there's all kinds of backroom racism.
Sorry, but remind our viewers what the senator said to her from Louisiana. He
She
said,
said she put her head in a bag. He told her
You
put her
should
head in
put
a
your
bag.
head in a bag.
Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, right? But the point is, but he said it, and I think as soon as he said it, you know, like first of all, there was a gasp in the room. You could hear it was very, very audible. The guy was like, oh, "How could he say that?" And I think somebody like him was like, I shouldn't have said that, or I'm going to regret having said that." Right? Well, I don't know. I mean, that's why my brothers say I'm naive. I don't know, but like I think, in other words, that I don't think that necessarily would have led to a gasp in the room 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Now it does because I think something is changing. I think. I don't know. I mean, what do you
Well,
think?
you have. I think you have numbers on your side. I mean, there's pretty good polling that says, basically for the first time ever, a critical mass, if not a majority of Democrats identify with Palestinians. That is new. That was not true before.
That was not true, especially youthful Democrats too, which is even
It's
more
generational. It's a generational
it's
issue. I think that's the issue.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a very clear generational gap here.
But I guess Ta-Nehisi, sorry, could I just on this point? So you're saying there's a change. We're all admitting. I mean, we see it with our students. I mean, on on university campuses, there's a huge shift taking place. Karim, you see this as well among your students, and in general, you're absolutely right. There's a change, and the fact that the fact that you yourself have written this book, is also, I think, emblematic and embodies this change, this moment we're in. That there's a message that people are, at least some people, more people are willing to listen to and receive, even if there's going to be a lot of pushback and a lot of racist backlash and so on and so forth. But you write on page 59, just to bring us back to your book, if you don't mind, on page 59, you say something incredibly powerful. You say that, quote, "We are Black people here and there." You're referring to Senegal as well as America. Victims of the West, a people held just outside its liberal declarations, but kept close enough to be enchanted with its promises, end quote. And so that liberal lure, isn't that exactly what stops people? Isn't that what stops people from realizing or listening to the message that you're sending? Because it's exactly that. There's this incredible power in being validated by the West. And you say something else also in the book. You have another beautiful passage about what your deepest fear was when you were in Senegal, about how the racists of the 19th century, you're always afraid that a part of you thinks that you're always grappling with what that horrible racist I can't remember the guy's name now, but whatever his name was, of the 19th century. So how do you deal with this thing? The lure on the other hand, like the rewards that are given to people, and on the other hand, we're talking about a generation shift. How do we make sense of this?
I can't answer that question right now, and I can't answer it largely because I regret that the way this book is written, it can't fully capture what happened to me during my 10 days, and then during my study afterwards. And one of the things it can't capture is the extent to which it probably has altered my politics, period. There's a way of doing this where it's like, oh, my politics are the same, but just throw Palestine in there. But my basic, viewpoints of the world haven't changed. And I think the real problem with the travel, and I have to emphasize the study after the travel, is that it started to get to bone deep things. And so like that, look, there's a way of looking at America and saying, hey, there's some good, there's some bad. If we throw out the bad and just keep the good, everything's going to be all right. You know what I mean? Like that is I think a very, digestible way of saying, even though you would get an argument from a lot of people, that's a digestible. And there was this book I read that I talk about a lot, and it's called, sorry, I had to dig it up. It's called The Unspoken Alliance. It's by this guy, Seth Polikow-Saransky. Do you guys know this book? Oh, man. It is a history of Israel's relationship with apartheid South Africa. It's a thorough history. And as I understand it, he is not the first person to do it. He's the one I read, and it is all of the stuff in the book. For instance, when the guy who is the prime minister of South Africa goes to Yad Vashem, it comes from that book. And when you understand that within living memory, within the short living memory, because we're still in the long living memory, within the short living memory of the Holocaust, like Israel was making common cause with apartheid South Africa. Not just making common cause, exchanging tips on how to oppress people. At one point, it becomes basically the largest arms exporter to South Africa. This export becomes so important that the leaders of Israel, when the world starts to condemn South Africa and is trying to get a worldwide boycott, that they say, this actually threatens our economy to let this go. That they...
You're talking, Ta-Nehisi, just to remind, we're talking about apartheid South Africa, of course.
We're talking about apartheid South Africa. Apartheid South Africa. And the relationship is continual. You know, it's constant. And I say that to say that, like, you read that and you think, like, there's a way of thinking about Israel, and it's like, oh, you know, and I'm sure you guys have encountered people like this. They say, oh, you know, if the peace plan had went through, if Camp David had went through, everything would have been okay. Like, I'm sure you run into people like that. And then you read something like this and you say, oh no, it was always bad. Like this was always problematic. You know, and I highlight that to say that this is the country that America says it has a special relationship with, right? And has long had a special relationship with, that it upholds. And, you know, we had our own relationship with South Africa. And it just makes you think, like, more structurally, like, you know, as opposed to, maybe I just needed to add another egg. Like, it makes you think, no, I shouldn't be baking a cake. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like this, like the whole idea of it deserves question. That is a long way of saying, when I wrote those sentences, I probably was of the, you know, just add another egg line. You know what I mean? That's probably what I thought. And I'm sorry I'm being vague, but I'm being vague because I actually don't know. Like, I'm still in, I have very deep questions at this point. I have very, very deep, profound questions. And that's what Palestine left me with. Because the lie of it all felt so extreme. Like, it felt so different from what I'd read and what I knew. Like, I cite Seth's book because I don't know how that's not common knowledge. Like, I just don't know how that's not part of the record. And it isn't. You know, I mean, it's shunted to the side. So what is being hidden? Like, what's really wrong here? You know, I think, and this is the last thing I'll say about this. Like, you know, I've been struggling with this notion of, or this narrative of Biden getting played by Bibi. Because it feels like it doesn't feel strong enough in its explanation for what's happening. It feels like there are forces that I don't quite understand that are acting here. You know, and I don't mean this conspiratorially. You know what I mean? Like, I mean like hard, actual, you know, forces, like, you know, an arms industry, for instance, the extent to which it is an arms industry perhaps operating. I mean, forces like that.
Yeah, but I see that, Ta-Nehisi, but also those same forces, I mean, they were different versions, but similar forces, let's say, similar corporate forces were also in play in the US or Europe to help sustain apartheid South Africa. The mineral extraction companies and the uranium companies and the gold miners and the diamond companies and all that stuff. Like they had, in other words, there were vested material interest in supporting apartheid in South Africa because
and that's what I want to know. What is the material interest in maintaining apartheid in Israel? That you put it in words for me. Thank you.
That's it. But the weird thing is, there's so many weird things. People often say like the apartheid in South Africa is the same as the apartheid in Israel or in Palestine, and including the occupied territories and everything, right? But it's actually not, in the sense that, I mean, if you go I've written about this in my own books on Palestine. Law by law, they're almost identical in all kinds of ways. But the fundamental difference is that apartheid in South Africa was about the exploitation of black labor. It was to make black labor more amenable, more controllable, more exploitable. They didn't have rights, etc. Whereas the apartheid in Palestine is about the elimination of Palestinians. It's not about exploiting them; it's getting rid of them, right? Putting them in Gaza and throwing away the key and and hoping that they just drown in the sea or whatever, which are expressions that Israelis have used on more than one occasion, and obviously now they're performing that, like, literally, right? So there are these similarities, but there are differences too. But I would also say, when it comes to apartheid South Africa, what made a difference in the end was that the I don't know if it's the moral price, but I think the boycott campaign made it such that the cost to keep doing business as usual became too prohibitive. In other words, for the big company, it was actually easier to get rid of this apartheid business and then somehow go back to finding other ways to exploit labor, which they've come up with, obviously.
You
Right?
don't think it was the Cold War? And I use that to say, maybe like I'm pointing towards macro forces here in general, even, in an attempt to understand, Israel and Palestine. Like, was it not just that macro forces changed?
No, I think the boycott. I mean, I think it happened. Obviously, it happened to coincide, but I think the boycott campaign made a gigantic difference, right? And I think also the reason why there are all these anti-boycott laws, all these anti-BDS laws in the U.S. is precisely, and also, by the way, the reason why it was for so long not illegal, but prohibited almost effectively to say this is apartheid about Palestine. Like, it became like, you can't now, as you're saying, it's like everybody, not everybody, but it's impossible to deny at this point, right? But it was, for a long time, it was quasi prohibited. Remember President Carter's book, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. It was 2006, I think it was, right? And it was like, wow, this is a scandal because he said it. But I think the times are changing. To go back to what we were saying earlier, I think there is more awareness around it now, and I think one reason why there's cause for optimism, in a sense, is that this new generation and people's growing awareness, and above all the genocide in Gaza, has made people more aware of the fact this can't go on. Like, if you look at what the Israelis are doing now, not just the burning people in tents in just last night, because they've done that before on several different occasions in Gaza in the past year. The destruction, now we're at the brink of, obviously they're destroying Lebanon too. We're at the brink of war with Iran. I mean, it's like all these kinds of things. This is not sustainable. It's not sustainable for normal people with moral ethics. It's not really sustainable, I don't think, for most companies. Yes, the arms dealers are making a lot of money, but like normal companies, there's many better ways to make money than this kind of thing. So I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that. Just to come back to the South Africa, Israel kind of, to that.
Wait, but so I think what I hear you saying, though, is that you think there aren't actually macro forces in that sort of way, in arms industry, a material interest like that. You don't think that's present?
No, I think Seti is saying there are macro forces, but there's also this question of, I mean, unlike we were in college in the 80s, so I remember, like, anti-apartheid was the big thing, and Bishop Tutu came to our commencement in 1988, or 1990, I can't remember, 1990, and he announced, and that was the moment when anti-apartheid finally had come to the fore, like that moment, that breakthrough moment. But I just think that there's the way, I mean, Sadi, you've written about this as well, and Karim, the way that Zionism operates, and Ta-Nehisi, since you've been to Palestine, you've seen, it's also, and the questions you keep getting, the attacks on you here in American media, is also basically, it's all about, they want to separate themselves from the Palestinians. Like, they want to pretend that what they're doing has nothing to do with Palestinians, and as if these are two separate things. So we want to have our Jewish state, they say. They ignore the fact that that's coming at the expense of these people. But, so they separate these things out. You're putting them, and of course, many people before have put these things together, and that's what upsets them. It's not that they're saying, so in their minds, they keep trying to hold on to this idea that somehow what they support is noble and necessary, and therefore, whereas because they completely exclude the Palestinians, they just don't want
to see.
Which is
why one of their arguments is, if you don't think that Jewish people have a right to self-determination to a state of their own. But of course, the problem isn't Jewish self-determination; it's that at whose expense is this being transacted?
Yeah, and to that point, there's something else that I just want to interject into this conversation. I actually haven't in most of my appearances, and this was clarified to me. The Jewish state, as it is defined right now, is a demographic project, and that is a huge thing. It's been openly said that an 80-20 ratio has to be maintained. See, the moment you say that, you cannot be democratic. You just can't be. It's not possible at all, because you then have to take policies to make sure that that's true. And at that moment,
Yeah, Ta-Nehisi, if you go back to the record, if you go back to the history, Karim, go ahead. You want to say something? I wasn't telling about the history of this. Like, if
No,
you
no,
go
go ahead,
back
go
to
ahead.
the
No, no,
early
no, go, no,
20th
no, go
century,
to the
yeah.
history.
So, no, the early 20th, I mean, the whole point of the Zionist project in Europe, because it develops in Europe first, it doesn't develop in the Middle East, among the Jewish communities of the Middle East. It develops in Europe in response to European questions, and then they want European solutions, basically
Right,
colonialism
right,
in
right,
Palestine.
right,
And their whole project was specifically to make the Palestinian Arab majority a minority. And they were
right.
explicit about this.
Yes.
And that's why they kept saying we can't have democracy in Palestine until we achieve a majority. Then we can have democracy. And then we have to figure out how to maintain our majority. And that's where we are. Has nothing to do with, I mean, it was, yeah.
Which,
Karim,
by
go
the way,
ahead.
means you can't have democracy. You can't like in order to maintain that, and that's the thing I'm getting. Like, if you want to maintain that demographic, you can't actually have democracy ever, ever.
They also have the expansionist part, so which is also very old. I mean, now we're talking about Lebanon. They want to come into South Lebanon. You have Smotrich coming and saying that Greater Israel includes not only Lebanon but also Syria, Iraq, and even parts of Saudi Arabia. So
Turkey
these
too.
guys,
I think they've
I
gone.
mean, you know, they keep expanding this thing, but this is an old story, and there is this tension. And I think you mentioned that in your book about somebody like Olmert, the former prime minister, etc. So there's this group of let's call them pragmatists who are like, guys, let's just concentrate on getting majority, making sure that we remain a big majority inside 48, so that we can have our little democracy but apartheid state. But we can't keep on annexing in the West Bank and other places where we're going to end up with this kind of parity or even majority of Palestinians. So let's cut our losses and just stop. But then you've got this expansionist guys who are now in power and are going to continue. There's no way they'll stop. And these guys are going to want to continue and occupy and push and push and push and push. And so I want to ask you about the flip side of this.
Wait. Before you ask me,
yeah, please,
I have to.
please,
How far
please.
does that go in your mind?
Which part? The expansion?
The occupied expansion, da da da. Like how far does that go?
For me, Lebanon for sure. South Lebanon for sure. They've been from 1919 until now. They've been going on about Lebanon, South Lebanon, and pushing the border. Even at the time between when they were trying to lobby the British to kind of put the border with the French for Palestine, Lebanon in 1919, they wanted it at the Litani River. So this thing is come and gone. But this idea of expanding into Lebanon, at least into South Lebanon, has been in their imagination a long time. So these guys now, the Smotriches, the Ben-Gvir, these guys are no longer the fringe people that we used to say, in the 80s, these are the fringe settlers that are kind of, no, these guys are in the government. They're the majority. They're running policy, and there's no reason to believe that they're not going to be around, for the years to come, especially if there's a war with Iran and a big thing, and the Israelis are attacked, and the Americans have to defend them, and you've got all of this. There's a lot that's going to be played out, I think, and I think this is. I think these guys need to be taken seriously for what they're saying. I don't think they're going to succeed. I really don't. They can't even get into 100 yards into South Lebanon yet. They're being hit by Hezbollah, and they're being, scores of their soldiers are being killed and wounded. So, so that's what I wanted to ask you about, resistance. And you gave this very, interesting interview with I think Trevor Noah. And you compared, October 7th, for example, and now we're a year and a week or so past October's, a year anniversary. And in Trevor Noah, you talked about, you compared it to, I think, to Nat Turner. And so this notion of linking, so we have all the colonialism, we have all these things, but we have all the resistances that come along with against slavery, against Jim Crow, against apartheid in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, the terrorist who became, the amazing guy that became, the hero to everybody in the world. So we have all this thing, but we have also groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, others, so not just these guys, but all sorts of violent and non-violent resistances. And so the question becomes, can you have systems of apartheid? So yes, Sally, you were talking about BDS and non-violence and kind of civil society and boycotting, and that's extremely important. But, I live in Lebanon, and we lived in occupation, all of us. And so the question becomes, can you confront an apartheid state? Can you confront a colonial state? Can you confront empire without having the option of violence there? I'm not saying it's good, and I'm not saying that but the concept in principle to have violence, to say can we resist occupation? Can we resist apartheid? Can we resist this encroachment, this greater Israel encroachment? Or do we sit back and do what the PLO did, which is, okay, we create the Palestinian Authority, we sit back, we negotiate, and Frantz Fanon talked about all this stuff. Yeah, sit there, negotiate, and then look at the West Bank and look at Gaza today. So Lebanon now, if you try to negotiate, what's going to happen to Lebanon? What's going to happen to South Lebanon? So I wonder what how you think about this question of resistance to all of this and the possibility of violence as part of this resistance.
Especially when you look historically, because I mean, like that the Trevor Noah interview, like one of the most powerful moments was that moment when he said, "What about?" I can't remember how exactly it came up, but October 7th came up, and you said, you believe in human life on October 7th, but also October 6th and October 5th, and that had you been 20 years old, and your father this and your mother that, or had you been, let's say, in the shoes of Nat Turner's, comrades, what would you have done? I mean, which is a question all of us have to ask ourselves that question. But you were doing it very honestly, which is, as you know, very unusual in the world that we're in right now. But yeah, so I just want to add that to Kareem's, like, also looking historically, in other words, at the Black American experience and its confrontation with slavery and these systems of power and exploitation and so on.
But Ta-Nehisi, thank you. That's incredibly, that's very eloquent. And of course, it speaks to, we feel often, all of us feel the same way. We all value and cherish, obviously, life, an innocent life. But the question is really more that you're sort of grappling with the ethics of resistance. But the question really is the ethics of resistance, and where does it go, and where does it lead us, and what are the costs? But you're starting
of some of the ethics of violent resistance.
But resistance, including violent resistance. But the premise, to even begin to interrogate that ethically and honestly, at least you're acknowledging, you're starting from the baseline of saying, I believe in liberation and equality. That's a bedrock, fundamental baseline. Then we can start debating, not this question of people who come and say, we're going to ignore the structural racism, the huge violence of the state,
but that's the other missing piece here, right? Which Ta-Nehisi also named in the writing and in that Trevor Noah interview and other play, and just now too. There's this. Nat Turner didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to go, do this thing, right? It's in a specific situation of structural violence. Same thing. And by the way, the same thing happened in the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution,
absolutely,
the Algerian Revolution, the Vietnam and Palestine, and India. Like, this is what happens in situations of colonial violence. This is Frantz Fanon 101. Situations of colonial violence produce more violence. So we have to address the what's driving them.
The question I have for you guys, though, for you guys, and I struggle with this myself. And Haiti's another one I think about, right? Like, Dessalines wins, and then they just slaughter all the white people that are left on the island, right? Are these inevitable rules? Like, is this inevitable? Is this just what it is?
Is what inevitable?
Counter violence, the violence of the oppressed.
And not just counter violence. I would go so far as to say massacre, like, and I'm trying to get away from the question of like blaming people, you know what I mean? Of like this kind of like condemnation, like literally in terms of
I would say you have the option. The option is surrender. Right. So this is, that's the option. The option is surrender. And we I write about it, talk about it. And, those of us that thought that Oslo, for example, as Edward Said said, he said it's the instrument of surrender. It was the Palestinian Versailles. So you can. PLO literally had to sign documents to say we renounce all terrorism, and they kept on, extending the definition of violence and terrorism and I don't know what, and then they had to do good governance and all sorts of hoops they kept having to do. So they said, okay, we surrender. We will accept the minimum of what we've been talking about all this time. And yet, as I said, here you are, 2-3 decades later, genocide in Gaza, you have pogroms going on in the West Bank. Clearly, there's going to be another push for ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, let alone Gaza. And I think they're still not finished with Gaza. They're not finished with their fantasy of pushing people out into the Sinai, into other areas. That's ongoing. And I think they, from their perspective, it's very serious, and they're going to do it. And the Americans are enabling it. Anthony Blinken's first trip after October 7th was to go there and to try to convince the Egyptians and the Saudis to open up the doors to Sinai and accept, basically ethnic cleansing. That Anthony Blinken is still in power. Trump now is saying that he's thinking of getting this guy, David Friedman, as foreign minister, as Secretary of State. So these guys will push this. This project is not going. So I think the Palestinians have an option to surrender. They can say, "That's it. We surrender. Put us in our Bantustans." The West Bank people can go to Jordan. The other guys can go to the desert somewhere and be taken care of a humanitarian assistance from the EU and from UAE and these kinds of places. The Lebanese can say, "We surrender. We accept."
Karim, you're not actually advocating that, correct? You're not actually
no,
advocating that, Karim.
No, I'm saying, in other words, there is the option. I mean, that option exists, but I'm saying that if you don't take that option, and if we're saying that these negotiations with a country like Israel, I don't know about I know about Israel,
but that's why. But Karim, that's why the dynamic going, like, it's there in Haiti, it's there in Nat Turner, it's there. It's in every single one of these cases.
So, but that's my point. The point is, okay, so if you can't negotiate in so-called good faith, even at the most minimal level, and you can't, I mean, I wouldn't want to surrender. People can choose, but I think most people don't surrender or choose not to surrender. And then you have resistance. So you can resist, and you can say nonviolent. You can say, let's get the social movements and the BDS and the civil society, and let's do all of this stuff. And you go and go and go and go. And what if your land keeps shrinking, and you keep getting into further into concentration camps like Gaza, the prison? They're counting calories. Forget October 6, October 5, October 1. They're counting calories. The aid was coming through. They were literally counting how many calories can get in for these people not to starve, kind of thing. All right, that could have continued for another year, 2, 3, 4. That was going to get worse. So I'm not advocating for violence in this. It's not.
No, I understand.
But the idea
I understand
is,
what you're saying.
It's how does one confront this kind of settler colonial movement, and at least in this case, and not say we have the right to resist in this kind of way.
I guess from my perspective, I'm less confused about the right thing. I guess I wonder, and again, I feel like I don't love abstracting this from what is happening right now. Especially on a day like today. And so again, I will pull this back to Black America. So that I'm not projecting on people. I guess the question I always ask in my world, and I've always asked in my world, and even in case for reparations, I was trying to ask, what are we trying to build, though? Like, what is
Yeah, I think your point is well taken, Ta-Nehisi, that there's a difference between resistance and liberation. These are two different ideas. There's resistance. It can be violent resistance, it can be nonviolent resistance, but resistance is about sort of insisting on your presence, and your continuation. Liberation is a different kind of project, because you have to include at some point those, who's in your community that you're trying to liberate. So these are two different questions. But I think the way, I guess we're all agreeing, I hope we're all agreeing, that the way this question of violence is always posed to the colonized, to the oppressed of the world, is extraordinarily racist in the way that they always go after the colonized when they react with violence, but they almost never talk about the vast greater structures of violence that oppress them, and that
they take those for granted.
They take these for granted. So we talk about
exactly.
We talk about terrorism, but we never talk about the state violence. I mean, it's extraordinary to me how these things work. So Ta-Nehisi, we don't want to take up more.
So just one last point, because it's not just structural violence; it's actual violence. I mean, I
actual
know I'm
violence.
getting messages. No. I mean, in Beirut now, as we speak, the Israelis are hitting civilian areas. And they're taking buildings, and the Israeli spokesman, every night they come out and they read a list. They put a little map on social media, by the way, and they give people 10, 20, 30 minutes to evacuate. They say, this neighborhood, this neighborhood, this neighborhood, you better get out. And people have to pick up and leave these neighborhoods. And you now have 25% of all of Lebanon is now under these so-called military evacuation orders. You have 1.5 million displaced. You're already combined, by the way, with 1.5 million refugees, Syrian and Palestinian refugees who are in Lebanon as it is, in a total population
in addition to Gaza. But Karim, point taken. But just for Ta-Nehisi, I know your time is precious and you have other obligations.
No, this is okay. I'm learning.
You're okay. All right.
Can I say that? Can I say also, I'm not trying to flatter you guys. I mean, again, I think I pointed earlier to the idea of one of the great privileges of having published this is it opening up communities that I didn't have before. And these are questions that we have in Black life, even now. You know what I mean? And they have a kind of a vividness, a starkness that is, generated, I guess, because things are ongoing. And so even hearing you guys talk, I mean, look, at my root, I'm a journalist. I would much rather be asking you the questions, than answering. So, I mean, please don't feel like you're imposing. You're giving me a lot to think about.
Well, in fact, Ta-Nehisi, you have 3 Palestinian Lebanese American academics. Ask if you had a question for us, if you want to. You don't have to, obviously, but if you wanted to, what would you ask us?
Oh man, come on. I mean, we would go down the line. Boy.
You don't have to, by the way, and of course you didn't.
No, I got a ton. I
don't
mean, I guess like so my questions are going to be like kind of dumb because I don't know, but like I think like I guess like when I think about resistance, since that's what we're on, and I think about Hamas and I think about Hezbollah, I guess I wonder how maybe you reconcile the fact of resistance and the right of resistance with the world that I suspect you're trying to achieve, and maybe the discrepancy between the world that they're trying to achieve and you're trying to achieve. And if I'm wrong on that basis, please tell me. But I think I'm probably not. And I just wonder how you reconcile those things. Does that make sense?
You mean Hezbollah and Hamas? You mean in the kind of sort of in the religious kind of dimensions of this?
Yes. Like their vision of what like the world looks like after victory, like what liberation is for them.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting that I mean I know more of the case of Hezbollah, let's say, and if you listen to what, of course, in the West you're not allowed to listen to Hassan Nasrallah before he was assassinated, and all the kind of speeches that he would give and everything. There's of course now there are clips going all around. For example, several times he was asked once. I think it was with Sari. Who was it? It was with I can't remember. Anyway, it was some prominent journalist. I think it was Julian Assange, in fact. And he asked him a question about this was obviously quite a few years ago. He asked him, what will you do with Palestine, and how do you see Palestine? Because of course this whole question of Palestine. And Nasrallah told him effectively what is a one-state solution. We want to all live, but equally in a kind of democratic structure. I mean, he said that. I mean, this is on the record. So, and I also want to say something else here. If you see, for example, over this past year, the cross-border, 80% of the so-called projectiles, according to the UN, have come from the Israeli side into Lebanon. If you see what Hezbollah has done, even to now, they have not targeted, they've not sort of targeted to kill Israeli civilians. It's military targets, and they go out of the way to say we're hitting military targets and kind of backing it up by saying we don't hit civilians. The other side make a point of hitting civilians, make a point of taking down this kind of display of taking down buildings, hitting extremely densely populated civilian areas, whether it's in Beirut or Nabati or in Baalbek and sort of different places in Beirut. And, so you have this sense of there's the modalities of it, what resistance should look like in the field, in the action. So this question of humanitarian law and how you go after civilians or do you go after military targets. I think this is important. This is something the Israelis have never respected. They've never respected this distinction, this use of humanitarian law is not something they've ever distinguished. How should a resistance movement whose technology is much less, whose ability to fight like that is much less, how can they get to defend themselves and resist an occupation or an invasion or kind of this larger settler colonial situation? So the way in which they set up, of course, there's a worldview that many of us don't like and reject. But in the moment, if there's an existential struggle going on, none of us have answers in this. These are questions. What would we do what would I do if I was in South Lebanon and we had been occupied, my village had been occupied, and my family had been killed in South Lebanon, or if I'm in Hamas now in Gaza and my entire family has been killed, what do I do at that point? And I'm not given an option. And then I'm expelled into the Sinai later.
But Karim, in a way, we come back. Like Ta-Nehisi's question was also about the vision, right? Because it's true. I mean, what you're saying now about resistance is really important, and it goes back to Ta-Nehisi's thought experiment about what would I do if I were 20 on October 7th and my father this, my mother that, right? And how would each of us react under those circumstances? What would we do if we were in the 1830s as Black Americans and Nat Turner and this kind of thing? But in a way, I think Ta-Nehisi, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think also your question is at some ideological level, the world, the image of a just solution proposed by these organizations may not be like the one that we're proposing. It's true that Nasrallah did say what Karim said he said about Palestine being basically a place where everybody can live in equality. That's when, of course, that is something that the three of us do fundamentally share, this idea that there should be a democratic but see, we would say democratic and secular state. That is a fundamental difference between kind of our worldview and the worldview of these organizations. But yeah, that, I don't know. It comes back to Osama's question about liberation.
Maybe to make this more concrete, to retreat back to, like, one of the things that broke Malcolm X from the Nation of Islam was a fundamental difference in worldview. Like, the world that they were trying to achieve was two different worlds. Marcus Garvey is a tremendous hero, in the Black community. Somebody else that was sympathetic to Zionism. His world was probably not the world that I would want. Even though I recognize, his contributions, I recognize, him as a heroic figure. I recognize, what he did for making Black folks feel proud of themselves and escape like the bonds of aesthetics and, looking in the mirror and feeling like, you aren't worth anything. But his world was probably not the world that I would have wanted necessarily. And these are things that, I have to, again, like, I probably have the luxury of bombs not being dropped on me right now.
Ta-Nehisi, I mean, you're absolutely, no, we all have the luxury right now of not having bombs dropped on us right now. Karim is going to Beirut soon, so we'll find out. But seriously, like,
we have all been there and done that too.
But the question really is one of context, and it's also one of, when you talk about, we've talked a lot about, well, not a lot, but Du Bois in a lot of his writings, in his early writings, and also even as late as 1940, he said, we don't have the luxury of resistance, of the kind of military. He was so acutely aware of the context in which he was living in the United States and how racist it was, but also the demographics of it, and the military imbalance, the power imbalance was so vast. So he said, we don't have, although he saluted the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, he saluted the Indian anti-colonial uprising as well. And as you said, later on, towards the end of his life, he then turns to Nasser, and he sort of, there's a recognition of Nasser and a turning away from Zionism. But he was also acutely aware of what was possible in the world and how could you accomplish the goals of freedom and emancipation within the system. The Palestinians and the Lebanese are in a very different settler colonial dynamic. And so the question of violence is also, because the Israelis are not even offering, like the Americans, the hypocrisy of what Du Bois called the white world, as you know, was that after the Civil War, after the whole point of Jim Crow, it was justified in this obscene way as separate but equal. This idea of saying it's about equality, but it's separation, which is absurd. And segregation was so disgusting precisely because of this mantra of separate but equal. The Israelis were never offering, they're not offering the Palestinians a future. And that's where we are. So the question of violence has to be tied to this question. If you're not offering people a future and you're offering them a miserable present, what do you expect them? I think the onus can't be on the people who are on the receiving end. The onus has to be on those who are more powerful, who are making these choices to create this framework within which we have to answer these questions. That's how I think of it.
There's another difference too. At least since 1865 or 1867, whenever the amendment was passed, African Americans were citizens. Like, African Americans are Americans, and I'm not saying that romantically. I'm saying that is literally a difference. You know what I mean? And so, for whatever one, whatever one thinks of this politically, like, Martin Luther King is making a citizenship-based argument. Like, you know what I mean? Like, on paper, the law says I am part of this, and you are not enforcing, this is inconsistent with the law, which, I mean, that is very different. It's very different.
Also, just one last thing, which I think is important just to add here, is that, a lot of this could go away if the United States just says enough.
Yeah.
So
that's our responsibility. That's our responsibility.
Exactly, but
that's on us.
But That's why your book, just to go back to kind of finish with it, that's why your book in that sense is so powerful, and those that write like you, because on the one hand you're writing the stories, and I just want to say that I think towards the end when you said you go back to Chicago, and you go and I think you're going to see somebody
Hassan
who was a
Jabbar.
survivor. Yeah,
Yes.
it was a survivor of the Deir Yassin massacre and their family. And then I think you said, if I remember correctly, you say, normally they wouldn't want their names on, but they wanted their names because that's, and you're the person that can deliver, that story. I found that extremely powerful. On the other hand, there's also this simple thing of saying, the US has this power. So the way in which we understand Barack Obama and understand Trump and understand Biden and Kamala Harris, of course, there's domestic, issues, but there's the extent to which these guys control our lives is direct. It's not indirect. It's not, okay, we send a bit of arms. They're there. It is, everybody in Lebanon and in Palestine understands this is an American-Israeli war. It's not either or, it's both. So the extent to which, if you get Kamala Harris and Trump in, and what they do or might not do, literally, is life and death in where we are, not in America. So that's why the movement in America and this idea of the generational change and people writing and talking more to try to change what's going on in America has a direct impact materially on people in that region. This is why I find, this is what I find extraordinary.
Ta-Nehisi, the last question, I know that we need to wrap for you, and is the question of, Seti asked, what question would you ask us? But is there a question that you would have wanted people to ask you that hasn't been asked of you in all these interviews you've done? Is there a question?
Oh no, I'm the question asker.
You're the question asker.
Yeah, I'm not the answerer. It's always an awkward position, man. I always feel like I would much rather be you guys. And I think one of the things that unfortunately happens, and I don't know why this has happened, but like how I see myself is somebody with questions going out into the world trying to answer them. And I feel like that's the essence of writing, right? Like trying to, clearly get to, some sense of things. But for whatever reason, at least between the world and me, the more perception is, the person that, gives the answers, who stands, who does X, Y, and Z. But I just want to say there's so much I don't know. There's so much I don't know. I appreciate you guys engaging, on this question of resistance. I hope we can continue it, off podcast, because it's a deep and profound one for me, and it's probably the reason why I would never be the leader of any resistance. Ill fit for it,
None of us, I think, none of us.
Right. None of us.
We write about it.
Yeah. And that's the other thing. You read about some of these people, you say, wow, these are heroes, but they are not me. Like, I'm not that person, I'm just not, like, in my bones, But having said that, I think you guys pose some really, really stark moral questions. And I just want to say, it really goes back to the core point I've tried to make in these interviews. Man, that there were things said when I went to see Hassan Jabbar and his granddaughter took me out for dinner. There were things said on that table that I cannot publicly say. And the world is poorer because those things don't get said. We have a greater misapprehension of what is happening because those things cannot be said. And I just, I appreciate you guys engaging me on this. I wish that I was living in a country that had the ability and had the structures to better engage. I know people very much listen. I listen to Makidi. How do I pronounce this? Because I read it all the time.
Makdisi.
See, I was about to say that wrong. Makdisi Street. I'm working on my Arab pronunciations, by the way.
Well, we worked on Ta-Nehisi, so there you go.
Right, and then you pronounced it wrong just now, so that's my revenge.
Say it again.
Ta-Nehisi.
Yes. Every day I look in the mirror and I say Nura Ericat, Nura, not Nora, Nura Ta-Nehisi.
We all have complicated names.
Yes.
We all have names.
Yeah, but I just wish this was a conversation that we were having more broadly, because I think it needs to be had, and I think we're poor for not having it. So I'm gonna thank you guys for that.
Thank you for
such a pleasure having you.
Yeah, honestly, and thank you for your voice and for the message.
Thank you.
Thank you
Talk
so
soon.
much.
I guess I'll see all of you soon, individually.
Okay, guys, that was an incredible interview with an incredible author. Sadi, what did you think?
I actually felt it was less of an interview, more of a discussion, especially towards the second half, more or less, because it became much more open. And it was honestly, it was incredible to see somebody like Ta-Nehisi who's had this kind of trajectory, who went on this learning, this incredible learning curve. And I don't. It's really it's hard to overstate how much admiration one has for somebody who is on a kind of a sort of normal, let's say, canonical, almost orthodox trajectory of within the contours of standard liberal thought, and then there's like this rupture, and suddenly he's thinking all new, like a whole different way, which of course carries with it, as we've seen in all the crap he's been getting, it carries a price and a cost too. I mean, even for somebody with his stature, there's a so this. I thought it was kind of incredible. The questions of, I mean, I really enjoyed enjoyed is the wrong word, but I really appreciated the questions the kinds of trans historical questions we were asking, going back and forth between Nat Turner in the 1830s and October 7th or Algeria or Haiti or whatever, like all these dynamics about resistance and how to push back, and the violent or colonialism as itself, as Fanon said, the embodiment of violence, and therefore produces violence in response. I thought that was incredibly enriching and rewarding. Karim, what did you think?
No, I agree. I think the conversation itself, I think, as you said, in the second half in particular, was very interesting. And we came at some point to the question that we try to wrestle with quite a bit in our podcast, which is, how do we think about resistance? How do we think about violence? And in this, and I think, Sally, you mentioned a few times the business of his interview with Trevor Noah, which I encourage, all our listeners and viewers to go go look at the YouTube, his interview with Trevor Noah, where he compares this thing, and we talked about Nat Turner. Misama, maybe you can talk more about who Nat Turner is, but the idea of being able to use violence, not use violence, I mean, a violent kind of moment and rebellion, which at the face of it, if you're just sort of describing it, is awful. It's really awful, and it's civilians, etc. But then when you contextualize it, it's not that one defends it as such, but when one contextualizes it and understands where it comes from and the history where it comes from, then it takes on a whole other kind of meaning. And of course, the problem that we all have, of course, is this, and so does he, is this question of talking in theory about a right of resistance and structural violence, and therefore the need to use violence. And on the other hand, its application where, people are hurt and there are, civilians that are killed, and there are issues. And then the question is, how do you deal with that? And this is the dilemma that really, at one way or the other, we all face.
Well, and I thought that was one of the things he did most powerfully, by the way, both in this discussion and in the one with Trevor Noah, which is it's deeply, deeply, it's honest. It's honest in a way that's actually very, very, very rare. Like the knee-jerk thing among basically, let's say, what's called polite circles in the West is, you must condemn Hamas. Like what's his name? The English guy who's got his talk show,
Piers Morgan.
Piers Morgan. It's always like,
it's hardly a talk show. It's hardly a talk show.
The
It's
Babel
it's
show,
a clown
whatever.
show.
That guy's like oh, but you condemn Hamas. You condemn Hamas. You condemn Hamas. Like that line, it's so hammered into people that it's not only it's a question of, he's saying, I want to understand it, and I want to put it in context, and I want to historicize it, and I also want to ask myself, could I like, with the humility involved there, could I say no? That's same in the context of Nat Turner too. Like if I were one of Nat Turner's movement, like what would I do? And the answer,
if I were an enslaved person and I were being brutalized and what would I do? And how can you condemn Nat Turner without condemning slavery?
Well, Sam, I think I think it's worth just spending 30 seconds if you can explain who Nat Turner is a little bit more.
Nat Turner was an enslaved person who was brutalized and who rose up in a revolt against the slaveholders, and in the revolt, massacred people, including children, babies, I think, if I'm not mistaken, And I will check that because I don't remember all the details, but I know that
No, no,
it
yes,
was a
yeah,
brutal.
he talks about that, in fact.
Yeah, and then he was of course persecuted and smashed, and the rebellion was smashed, and it was made into this showcase thing of how to keep the enslaved people in their place. And it was a horrible. The whole thing was horrific, and the racism involved in the repression of Nat Turner and the stories told about Nat Turner and about Black people, became part and parcel of the fabric of racism in America. That Ta-Nehisi was Ta-Nehisi, sorry, was talking about. And so, in a sense, same thing with CLRJ, with the Black Jacobins, the Haitians who rebelled against French racism and French slavery and French colonialism, who also, of course, used armed struggle and were very violent in many instances. But of course, they were in the context of an extraordinary system, not just system, as Kenyon pointed out, but also actual violence, of systemic, actual horrific violence. Same with the Algerians, same for the Vietnamese, same for the Arabs, same for the Palestinians, and so on and so forth. So that's the short answer. But I think what was interesting, Sadi and Karim, is how honest, as Sadi was saying, it's an honest discussion in a sense, but also how rare it is to have these kinds of discussions with authors such as him in the mainstream. So even the mainstream questions, the questions that get asked of him, they're so carefully scripted, and there's so clearly, the guardrails are so clearly set out, that it's very, very rare. I mean, you read the book and you get one thing, and then you get on the interviews and it's a very different, because the questions they ask him. I'm not even talking about the racist, obscene questions of that CBS guy who tried to
I thought that
ambush
was a
him.
great question. No, I think that was
Well,
great.
unintentionally,
And I think he did as well.
No,
Unintentionally.
as a pedagogical thing, you
The
mean,
first clip,
but not.
it showed the contrast. It kind of revealed a certain thing, that if you show empathy with the Palestinians, empathy is not. He wasn't advocating for a mass rebellion. He was just he was empathizing with Palestinians and
He
showing,
was humanizing
basically
Palestinians, telling
he
their
was
stories.
humanizing them, and the violence with which the guy was responding because he was humanizing it really revealed a lot. And I think that was very important, actually.
But this goes back to the point that Sadi, you've made in your work and your book on denial, Tolerance is a Wasteland. This whole idea of the way the Zionists, and especially liberal Zionists, and these are most of the critics who are on these shows, who are attacking him, the way it's precisely because they think somehow of Zionism totally separate from the Palestinians. It's as if these are two separate things, so
Yeah,
that you can.
which is
Right?
why
Isn't
their
that what
knee-jerk response is always, "Oh, you oppose Jewish self-determination." It's like, no, Habib, you've got nothing. I've got. I'm not. That's not the issue. The issue is that's at whose expense is it? If it really was this barren desert land where there was nobody there, then that's fine. But that's not. That's exactly not what the situation actually was.
But is there not an irony, guys, at the fact that Edward wrote Permission to Narrate in 1984? And here we are in 2024, 40 years later. We asked him this question. But nevertheless, it's still Ta-Nehisi who's writing about Palestine. And he says it. He's very open about it. He says, I don't want to represent Palestinians. I'm not here to represent. I'm here to learn and to translate and ask questions, he keeps saying. And I believe him. But nevertheless, in the end, in the mainstream, it's still Ta-Nehisi who gets who is, at least he's being honest, and there's a lot of integrity. There's an extraordinary amount of integrity in what he's doing, and he's saying it comes out of his own upbringing. He said that about his parents. But here we are. It's still not ultimately.
No, but he's also relating
Palestinians
it. He's relating it to his own, as he
no,
says,
of course,
his own ancestry
yeah,
and his own stories of his own
100%,
families. Yeah,
absolutely, yeah. But that's why it's so powerful. That's why it's so real. It's so genuine. It's so empathetic. I mean, it's one of the most empathetic accounts I've read of the Palestinians in years, honestly. And yet, Edward, as I said, wrote Permission to Narrate in 1984. So how far have we actually come? And I suspect the answer is we've come a fairly long way, because in the end, he still refers to a lot of people in the text, in the book, The Message, to various authors and various Palestinians with whom he's encountered and listened to and learned from. So, I think it's overall, I'm grateful to this experience.
Yeah, I found it there's a kind of deep humanity there that's actually unusual in the world that we're in. Really, a sense of humanity and awareness, self-awareness, a capacity for self-criticism and humility, which all of us, really could learn from, I think.
Also, I think just one last point here, which is, I think this notion of yes, there's humility, and there's the stories that he tells, and as I think we've been saying quite a bit on this podcast and others, that the younger crowd, the younger people in the United States, in the West in general, I would say, and outside the West, there is a sea change that's happening, and there's a generational shift that is taking place. I have no doubt about this. On the other hand, the kind of criticism and the attacks, racist or not, on someone like this, who's at this point a kind of celebrity, and can't really be touched at a certain level. The violence that's meeting his book tour and his interviews. Imagine if you're not quite at his level of he's not as you're not as
Yeah,
well known as he
but
is.
Karim, we shouldn't. We shouldn't. I think we shouldn't like over. I mean, there's been a lot of support too. I mean, he's also been on a lot of shows where he's been given a platform, and there've been interviews with people who are sympathetic, and so I think
No, I
the
agree.
point about these
I
attacks,
just think there's a violence.
have been, yeah, there's been a violence, but it's not the violence. It's a violence coming out of profound insecurity. It seems like.
Oh no, I'm 100% agreement. I'm just saying that the violence is coming from those that have a lot of resources, and that this is what we always come back to. There's a smaller minority of people who have far greater resources and reaches to the kind of the politics and to a lot of the social media outlets, etc. All these things, and this is something which I think these stories, and that's why it's important. These kinds of stories, permeate. They go through this because it's humanizing, and in the end, people relate to human stories. People just relate to that. That's just how it is. So that's why I think it's this. I think I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Thank you.